Hello all. We still have people logging in, so we're going to give them a few seconds to get settled, and then we'll get soon underway. Thank you for joining us. Just a few more seconds. See, more and more participants are coming in. I think we're ready to go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's in-session talk. We have around 300 guests from 25 countries joining us today for our in-session talk, Is Creativity Missing in Leadership? Before introducing you to our esteemed guests, Adam, Rama, and Ve, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share a link to the recording after the event. We also invite you to ask your questions by using the Q&A button. Please use the chat button if you have any technical difficulties regarding today's webinar. And finally, we aim to have an interactive session, and we'll introduce polls during the talk, and you will be able to submit your answers online. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Adam Kingl, Rama Gheerawo, and Ve Dewey. I'm going to hand you over to Ve, who is going to start today's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Again, thank you for joining today's Royal College of Art in-session event on leadership and creativity. My name is Ve Dewey, and I'm currently an Innovation Fellow here at the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design at the RCA. I'm quite chuffed to be in conversation with Adam and Rama around a topic that's really a major passion of mine, leadership and also creativity. Currently, we are witnessing the failure of traditional leadership across all areas of society and at all levels. In 2019, the World Economic Forum acknowledged that we do have a problem. Something is broken here, that old leadership models do not work, and it is actually getting worse. There must be a big shift in leadership. It is long overdue. Studies done by both Deloitte and the Churchill 21st Century Statesmanship Global Leaders Program found that there is a systemic complexity gap within leadership, that leadership lacked necessary cognitions and skills to handle rising complexity of society. And even with this existential intensification of our societal and planetary issues, we continue to see ineffective and inappropriate leadership models that reflect more of the Enlightenment rationalists of the master and process possessor than of being a good ancestor. This is evident from our governments to corporations and across all sectors, and even in some sectors that are surprising, like the design and creative sector. We are instead of focusing on the objective and flourishment, one looks to the subjective and quick wins. When being regenerative is an imperative for the future of society, extraction continues at an alarming pace. And when inclusion is the difference between obsolescence and longevity, exclusion continues to be embraced. Why does this inability of leadership persist? But more importantly, what is missing that is not allowing for leadership to transition to a model that's more appropriate at this juncture? Before I dive into conversation with Adam and Rama, just in case some of you are not familiar with them, I'd love to briefly introduce each of them. Adam Kingl is a globally renowned expert in innovating management practice and strategy and leading the modern workforce. He's an authority on generational paradigms in the workplace, the future of work and capitalism, and fulfilling organizational and personal purpose. He currently leads developed executive education at institutions from the likes of London Business School, Muller Institute, Churchill College at Cambridge, to UCL School of Management. And most recently, Adam published his book, Sparking Success: Why Every Leader Needs to Develop a Creative Mindset. Rama, besides being the director of the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Design here at the Royal College of Art, he is an international figure within design, a Design Week Hall of Fame award in 2019, and was named 2018 Creative Leader by Creative Review alongside Paul Smith and Bjork. Within his practice, he addresses diversity across age, ability, gender, and race. He is a serial innovator of inclusive design and design thinking. He holds visiting professorships and advisory roles globally for business, new ventures, universities, awards, and initiatives from the DNAD, the Valuable 500, to the Global Disability Innovation Hub at London's Olympic Park. Leadership is known to be one of the most widely researched and published topics. Yet, as I read, reread, and reflected upon both Adam and Rama's books, what stood out to me that there is an authenticity both Adam and Rama brought to leadership in their individual books that I have rarely experienced when reading other leadership's books. So on that note, I would love to dive into as I framed it, origin story. And I think it was very appropriate, Adam, when before you're raising the books. So to begin our questions, I'd like to ask, what brought each of you to writing books on leadership? I guess, Adam, let's start with you.
My pleasure. Thank you. That's a very kind introduction, Ve. I once spoke with another academic colleague, and he was trying to explain why he does research or why he writes books. And he said something that really resonated with me. He said, I will write an article or a book if I find myself observing something and asking a question about it. For example, I don't understand why that's happening. And if I don't know the answer to it and I'm curious enough about it, then I'm gonna jump into it and try to figure out the answer. So I think it comes from curiosity. In my case, it came from the reason I wrote Sparking Success about creative leadership is it came from my seeing a number of statistics a few years ago that were troubling. These were various studies, often done by Big Four consulting firms. One was asking CEOs all around the world, what are your top priorities? And creativity and innovation was a top 3 priority in 79% of the time. So basically 4 out of 5 CEOs are like, this is a top priority. Then at the same time, in that same year, another management consulting company did another global survey of the rank and file of employees all over the world, asking them how good your company is at creativity. Now you know what's coming. The vast majority, 94% of the people who answered the survey said, we're terrible at it. So at that moment, I said, is there a bigger gap in the corporate world today between an aspiration and a reality? So I wanted to delve into how, therefore, can organizations improve their creative capacity.
Rama, would love to hear your origin story, how you brought your
Sure. Thank you. And you know, again, like Adam, sometimes I don't recognize myself in an intro. So thank you for that very generous intro. I think similarly, you know, I feel like Adam, we may be saying this quite a lot in this talk, but it's kind of same, but different. The lack of creativity in leadership was astounding for me. And the drive to write the book really came from about 15 years of research, 13 years when I started writing the book, which really asked a couple of questions. It started with the gentle power of dissatisfaction around the fact that so many people are not included in leadership, the fact that design, which I believe makes every conversation better, it's a tool for solving, a tool for creation, it's a process, it's a way of life for me, was often left out of leadership conversations. So that single insight of we need more creatives in leadership positions, which was an entirely selfish thing, I must say as well, or not an entirely selfish thing, but it was slightly self-focused. But then the realization that came hot on the heels of that, which is you also need leaders who are creative, and that opens it up to the whole human race. So I think the final thing, and this is something I haven't said in an interview before, because Ve and the in-session group, we wanted to give you something special, but I realized there was many groups that were flying the flag for excluded or ignored you know, communities, you know, whether it's people of color or whether it's looking at gender or sexuality or age. And I was asking, is there like one thing that can bring them all together, a universality of qualities that come together to form leadership? And that's when the trifecta of empathy, clarity, and creativity came to bear. And, you know, a neuroscientist, you know, subsequently, and a research fellow that joined the team subsequently really added the kind of value and the research credibility to that.
Both of you are touching upon a topic in leadership that I feel, maybe a few years ago, people probably would not be gravitating towards. 3 years ago, but maybe even a year ago. Would love one dive into one question on that. And basically, have you thought about the reason why you couldn't talk about your leadership, your thoughts around leadership, be it creative leadership, be it, the theory around your sparking success, Adam? Why couldn't we talk about this 3 years ago or even a year and a half ago? And like, what are the reasons why, do you feel? Because I think this is an integral time, because we're seeing people connecting more and more to leadership conversations as a whole, but also this creativity angle. Rama, would you mind diving into that? Because I know that this has been a thread we've touched upon at times.
I think people don't fully understand creativity, and sometimes they're scared of it. The creative sector isn't just about design. Different governments have different definitions, but it can span almost everything, and some values show that it's one of the greatest contributors to an economy. And as we move away from manufacturing to services in many countries, and I have no political comment on that, this is more of a creative one. Creativity becomes important, but it's almost educated out of us. If you ask a 5-year-old to draw something, they'll do it. Ask a 55-year-old, they'll say why. And so there's the educative aspect, but the other final point is really, I think I'm going to give a slightly uncreative answer here. We need to listen to the numbers, because the numbers show that if you include creatives, your company, your bottom line, your diversity, the kind of very fabric, the lifeblood of your company or your organization will be better. And the numbers are out there, but somehow they're not crawling to the top. And when they do, I think Adam's example shows how is it about paying lip service? And quite often it is. Yes, creativity and innovation. Do we have a follow through? So I do love the tools that are given in Adam's book, because I think they do show how to deploy this. A little plug for you there, Adam. As you said, you enjoyed reading mine.
I very much did, yes. Could I give two answers actually to your question? One is specifically, you said like 2 years ago, why weren't we thinking about this? Part of it was, of course, 2 years ago, we were in the midst of COVID lockdown. And I think a lot of companies were saying, stick to your knitting. We got very reactive, very retractive. And of course, huge opportunities, I think, were lost, where organizations were saying, let's just survive. And therefore, opportunities were lost to leapfrog, to be exponentially creative, because your context had exponentially changed. But instead, people were actually becoming so conservative in the way their organizations were led, that we came out of lockdown not just with the legitimate scars of the experience, but our organizations are actually now even less prepared to be adaptive, inspirational, because we have 3 years of practice of doing exactly the opposite. So that would be my first answer. My second answer is a wider picture, and that is, you mentioned kindly, Ve, that I've sort of looked at capitalism and how it's practiced. Well, the interesting thing is that capitalism actually is not practiced the same way, either in this country right now, on this globe right now, but also over history. So if you look all the way back to obviously a preeminent time of creativity and creative leadership, at least in the West, in Europe, that would be the Renaissance. And at that point, we had this rich mix of the estates of commerce, the arts, and science and technology. And by the time we hit the Industrial Revolution, the arts were pushed away, and it became a cozier domestic arrangement between business and science technology. And I'm not being critical of science and technology in saying that, but I'm saying this beautiful constellation of human achievement was removed from our starscape of human achievement and became instead scientific management, which perhaps you could argue was appropriate for a time of many countries that were experiencing prosperity, but that the way in which we define management in that time assumes that a human being is an automaton, a robot. You know, turn this screw 90 degrees and then wait for the next unit to come and do it again. Well, we have robots now, so we don't need humans to do that. So what are human beings for? And this leads us to ask us, well, then what is leadership for? Because leaders are going to influence human behavior in these social constructs we call companies. And I would argue it's certainly a lot less about leadership as controlism today, and much more about how do we be more relevant tomorrow than we are today. And we have a lot of making up to do on that path since how we experienced work over the last few years.
Yeah, on that note, I remember reading, there's a couple of great lines where you're mentioning this about how school society are to blame, incentivizing conformity, Adam, and that just like really struck a note. And that's where it basically, it causes that paucity of creativity. And it's such a undervalued. And even though there have been some people here and there, I've seen like there's this one design executive over in the US named Leland Mashmeyer, and he's like, creativity is financially messy in the beginning. He saw the value of it because it pays off. And just it's really frustrating when we see how executives are continuously saying, yes, creativity, tick the box, but it's the application, it's the follow through, it's the objectivity of how they apply it. So on that note, I would love to dive into seeing where you might see the greater leadership picture within the current global leadership landscape. Who do you feel is a leader who embodies the key leadership attributes for this transitional world, and why? And I'm assuming someone like who embodies some creative attributes. So maybe Adam, especially since you're going on that line of the conformity, I think that could be a nice loop in there. So.
Sure, no, yeah, absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right. I think schooling and sort of traditional methods of schooling in some ways negatively harness creativity, right? We know that the late great Professor George Land of the University of Minnesota studied children in schools and assessed them at how much of a creative genius were they. When they were 3 to 5 years old, 98% of them were creative geniuses. That same population, when they were 25 years old, only 2% were creative geniuses. So it has nothing to do with our human capability. It has to do with how we incentivize and practice achievement, one right answerism, etc. I'll save that for another time, but I just thought worth noting. But in terms of leaders, I specifically tried to find leaders who were highly successful in the creative arts and that were practicing habits, behaviors, processes that could be applied in just about any industry, even so-called traditional industries. So I was trying to find, for example, who were the great leaders of the playhouse, and could you apply those habits in the warehouse? And one that I was incredibly inspired by was Sir Clive Gillinson, who is currently the artistic and managing director of Carnegie Hall in New York City, the Performing Arts Center. He used to be the managing director of the London Symphony Orchestra for about 20 years, and he's been at Carnegie Hall now for almost 20 years. But interesting, remember how I described him? He's the artistic and managing director. That's rare. And it's kind of a shame that we have to use two titles to describe that he's a creative leader, but that's where we are right now in our evolution. I'd rather we celebrate it and note it, but over time, I hope we should assume every leader is also the creative leader of its organization as well. And he said, look, I can't be a managing director without being a creative director as well. Not because his organization works in the creative arts, but because when you do work in the creative arts, you are constantly needing to adapt to the cultural context of the moment, to the needs of society, etc. So he thinks that these things are not, it's not one or the other. You can't wear one hat or the other. You always have to wear both. And that changes his perception about how do you lead and also how do you manage risk. I mean, Ve, you're talking about how a lot of often creativity is repressed, and part of it is because most organizations would always opt to finance the status quo idea because I know with some certainty there'll be a marginal improvement in the ROI. But if I have a creative idea, I don't know. what the ROI is. And so I put a discount on it. And so I will put a much higher hurdle on the IRR I expect from that idea. And therefore I just won't fund the idea at all. And so Clive has been really clever about rethinking how you manage risk, among many habits.
Yeah. Would you like me to jump in, V? So I think building on what Adam has said, I think a big part of me as well is how we discuss and view and talk about leadership. So, that was also, in your question, the word leadership, because oftentimes I've said, I'm here to talk about leadership, and people say, why do you want to talk about something that is so defined? You're either a leader or you're not. You're either born with the qualities or you're not. You're either a boss or you're not. And all of these things that we've heard over the years. And for me, leadership, the leader I want to see is the one in the mirror for all of us, because leadership is a human activity. But again, that's edited out alongside creativity. Certain types of people are leader. I was never put in charge of anything at school, and my last school report said he would never be a leader, which, actually drove me to investigate that statement a little bit more. But humanly, I think the tools Adam has in his book, the kind of processes and life experiences, are open to us all. Empathy, clarity, and creativity can be upskilled, can be expanded upon. So there is something here of, are we being life limiting when we think of leadership as a corporate rat race, as a title, as a destination or a position within a company or an organization? Or does leadership start within? Lead yourself first, then you can lead others. So a big part of leadership, I believe, is about that self-work. And, there's another dichotomy that I noticed. If you want to improve yourself, eat more carrots, do more yoga, have some quinoa, change your lifestyle. And then on Monday morning, we need to change the organization. We'll pull in, a management consultancy or a creative consultancy, hire them, and then ignore what they say. And go back to that small ROI, that, the incremental change, the tick box change that will keep a shareholder or a stakeholder happy. But one of the very first workshops I did 15 years ago looked at people's personal aspirations. And I can talk about this. It was in the Far East, and it was with the country's leading medics. And their aspirations, their human aspirations, and the aspirations of the department were radically different. And it was the first time in about 15 years for many of them that those things were highlighted. And that sparked off a leadership conversation, because I'm not saying it should always be the same. But if it's really different and you're a humanist, you've become a civil servant to serve civil society, but all you feel you are locked into is kind of defending budgets. How does that speak to the leader in you, the one that wants to connect? So I've totally not answered your question and not given you a name, but there's many, many names out there. And if I can say two sentences about one of them, a person I really admire is called Caroline Casey, who didn't know she was visually impaired until she was 17. Age 29, she stepped back from a management consultancy, was the first female Western elephant driver, went across India on an elephant, 1,000 miles, raised £250,000 for a sight loss charity in Ireland, and has now kicked off something called the Valuable 500, which challenges 500 CEOs to take action for people with disabilities. And she talks about resilience and joy being two qualities of a leader and two qualities of creativity.
Oh, it's a wonderful story. What you just said, Rama, reminds me of later on in your book. There's this one line that says, "It is enough to be invited to the table. You also have to eat." And just thinking about having that seat at the table, about bringing creatives to the table. We've been hearing about that for years. I feel like it's almost like a cycle of a dog chasing its tail, in essence. But I do want to like ask a quick question is, when it comes to the leadership levels that we are witnessing, we do see more opportunity that Rama has noted, but do you feel there's enough creativity within these leadership levels that make the impact, that create the most impact? And what do you feel needs to be done to remedy this?
Shall I have a go? So, well, I think first of all, I think it starts with who is leader, right? Who is the leader in an organization? And of course, I think leaders emerge up, down, and across an organization. I wish we could stop thinking quite so pyramidally about organizations, because if you say all the decisions come from the leader at the pointy bit of this pyramid, then everyone else can abrogate all responsibility for initiative, for entrepreneurship, for creativity, for being more customer centric, et cetera. So you know, I certainly think leadership is a lot more non-hierarchical than paradigms of centuries or even just decades ago. And Rama's book is really what I would refer to find new definitions of leadership, which is quite brilliant. But it reminds me that, you know, we shouldn't wait until we say, like, I have the title of manager. Like all of a sudden, I need a direct report relationship before I could possibly think of myself as a leader or a manager. Because of course there are bellwethers across an organization, and they have more authority, informal authority, soft power than we give them credit for. We can all think of these people, right? Those people who you take your emotional cue from. How should we think about this company decision? Where should we be going with this initiative? Who should I be talking to find out what's really going on? Often these are not the senior most people at the pointy bit of the pyramid. But that also tells us it's an opportunity, a wasted opportunity, to leverage leadership at every level. So that's my relatively short answer.
I think just to add, whilst I had an answer prepared, and then listening to you, Adam, another one came up, which is really, yeah, again, you know, is the leader the person at the top? And what does the top mean? Because quite often that means the bottom, quite often the person who's least in touch or most insulated. And I want to go back to a story here in design, because one of the most influential leaders and pictures that I saw is 20 years old, was a Japanese CEO called Sadamura-san, who was tasked with creating a whole new tube line, basically MRT line, called the Nanakuma line in the city of Fukuoka. And he went out and did the research. He went out with visually impaired people, with pregnant women, with parents with pushchairs, and looked at all the difficulties they were having in transit. And he turned around and said to me, I don't want someone else telling me who I should be designing for, or what problems or situations or joys or failures they're experiencing. I want to stand next to them and see that. And it just came to me that in an organization, who's willing to do that? And the question there is, who holds the heart? So, and the other sort of metaphor that I think of, it sort of came to me when I was 19 and interviewing for a job at a car company, 500 applicants, 2 places. And one of the things they said to me, what are you? What do you bring to the team? And I said, I don't know where this came from. I think I'd been doing too much building work at the time. I was also working on a building site. But I said, you know, we call something a brick wall. And they said, yes. I said, it actually should be called a brick and cement wall, because without the cement, it's just a pile of bricks. So I'm cement. I'm not a brick. I'm not locked into one track of work or leadership. And you know, within that company, I did actually end up working with all the different departments. And when I left, I had 7 parties, from the characters in the kind of control room, in the workshops, all the way through to HR and, even the dinner staff. And that was a leadership lesson at aged 19. And that's when I realized my school report might be wrong.
If I could just build, you brought up a really interesting point that I think is worth highlighting, and that is that often, every organization would claim it is oriented to its customers or its clients, right? Every decision we make is in the service of our customers. The problem is often those decisions are made by the senior-most people who were promoted because maybe they were very good with serving their customers and clients, but they actually haven't personally addressed or learned about a customer or client for years or even decades. And yet they're making these critical strategic decisions based on assumptions of what customers wanted maybe 20 years ago versus, asking people who are talking to customers now.
Adam, on that note, just reminded me, I remember I was talking with somebody in the US who used to lead a product design department. He said the best leaders that we have, or he's seen, are the ones that stick their necks out the most, to the point that they almost get fired, but they don't. And I feel like there's something there about having the ability to almost like let go of that, letting go of, like, as Gordon McKenzie said in Orbiting Giant Hairpole, to fully create, we must first find the courage and willingness to let go of the strategies that have worked for us in the past, let go of our biases and foundations of our illusions. So it's like holding, like that one executive, that car company of like consumer experience, is like letting go of those, the status quo of what they are supposed to do. But it's so often you don't see that, but you need to do that. I feel like you need to do that even more now in our society. And could it be, on that note, could it be like, how can we infuse creativity? I think if we infuse creativity more into those higher stagnant levels, we could push the push the envelope. So, but how? But how? Like, that's the one thing. Like, how can we get them up into that? So, Rama.
So I think, see, we're very good, Hervey. We're waiting for you to tell us what to do.
Jump in.
No, but one thing, Adam talked about, and it comes up again and again in your book, is the sort of that theme of needing to step beyond, of doing something different, of accepting something new into the life, and the tools and the strategies for that. So I think you talked about risk just now, and the other barriers that are there. When I was looking at creativity and doing some research for, it was just research at that point, it wasn't necessarily for a book, but starting off in China with a group of Chinese CEOs, actually asked them personally, this is a safe space, what do you see? What are the things you hate about creativity? What comes to mind when you have this guy from London standing here talking to you about creativity from an art college? What comes up in your mind? And they came up with 5 or 6 things, and I think they formed the basis for 8 barriers, which are things like time, it's trust, it's mindset, it's risk is there, budget, of course, is there, support. And I think in trying to write that, and it represents as a sort of little cartoon, it's a triathlon, or not even a triathlon, it's a kind of obstacle course with this little person who's trying to be creative and has got to get through this obstacle course, the shark pit of mindset, the mountain of bureaucracy, the swim across the sea of lack of support. Oh, there it is. So you can see it there. I love the way you have props, Adam. It sort of reminds me of childhood Punch and Judy shows and various things coming in. Really animates it. So I think we need to address those seriously internally within ourselves, because what are our preconceptions? If as Adam was talking about, you've been taught that leadership is a certain thing, creativity is a certain thing, but I do believe it's not just edited out, but it's somehow feared as well. And creatives are seen as these slightly wobbly characters. You don't know what you're going to get out of them in the end. Yet we have tools and we have languages and we have processes. And I say that as an ardent and passionate creative and a design fundamentalist. If I'm fundamental about anything, it's design. So those barriers, we need to look at them face on and admit that they accept. You know, it's not the ghost of Christmas past. You know, it's the kind of phantom of Christmas, the poltergeist of Christmas present.
And I would circle like 3 times the barrier of fear, like fear of failure, you know, as what holds an organization back from creativity. And of course, that starts from an organization's leaders. What is your attitude if your people try something and it isn't, you know, 100% perfect? I surveyed 200 European HR directors a few years ago, asking them about their organization's attitude towards failure. And I gave them a few options, and you can imagine it was a spectrum, right? Everywhere, everything from we celebrate failure. In fact, we even have failure parties where we all want to learn from, you know, from that, all the way down to if you fail, you are fired, and we do not speak of you again. You are banished. Unfortunately, over 50% of the responses were on the lower 50% of that spectrum of like failure is viewed negatively. And I will be the first to say, sure, you might want to set some guardrails. We're not saying it's just chaos. Let's all just run around like headless chickens. However, that attitude of unless you have a perfect idea, don't bring it up. After a while, of course, what you'll discover is no one will propose any idea because the incentives are much stronger not to keep your head down or wait for the boss to propose something and then go, yes, boss, that's what we should do. That's a brilliant idea because it's riskless. So if the nature of your work is more about survival than about helping us succeed and thrive and be more relevant tomorrow than we are today, I think you'll always be hindered in terms of being a creative organization because your culture isn't set up for it. But more tactically, if I could just give like 3 conditions to say how to be a more creative organization, I would say I have 3 really simple diagnoses related to leaders. 1, if someone comes up with a new idea, how many people do they have to get approval from to prototype it or to have a little bit of time to, you know, try it out? So obviously, the greater that number is, the worse. 2, how easy is it to get a little bit of money or a little bit of time or a little bit of resource, a colleague, whatnot, to explore a new idea for a bound amount of time, etc. Right? And again, if that's really, really difficult, then you have all these it's just too hard, right? The bureaucracy is just preventing you. 3rd, perhaps most importantly, is every manager in that organization, do they have a personal objective or KPI to foster creativity in their team? Because if they don't have any personal stake in the game, then anyone who comes up with and proposes a new idea in that team are only begging the patience of the manager instead of helping create a win-win.
Could I just make a 1-sentence comment on that? I think, you know, I'm writing these down as well because I love the idea of approvals are inversely proportional to creativity. And I'm going to get a tattoo of that, or at least put it on the wall, because I think that's just beautifully simple. And just one thought around, you know, the process of appraisals. And, you know, we've worked with many different organizations, but appraisals kind of come down to, you know, 5 or 8 or 10 objectives. And even in the word objectives, you know, why don't you have 10 subjectives? What are your subjectives alongside the objectives? What are the internal things that you wish to flourish and see and kind of flush from within you throughout the company? What are those things you want to propagate? So I do think even things like appraisals, which talk about objectives rather than aspirations. And, you know, once we worked with a company who kept on saying, we can't do this creative idea because of our KPIs. So we then used creative leadership to change their KPIs so key performance indicators, into KPAs, key performance aspirations, because then it gives you something to aim for, something to be better towards. And they were very human. And, it was an airline, and their KPIs were linked to performance. And we said your tech team can measure 140 data points that lean into 3 other Ps: people, plane, and place. So add those 3 things to performance. And of course, people are incredibly important. Sorry, V, I just wanted to riff off Adam's three wisdoms.
You're on mute.
No worries. I was hoping you would dive in because I was like, I could see a hook right in there to leading into some of the creative leadership projects and work. So I was really happy to hear that. Before we go any further, I'd love to see if we can throw up one of the polls so we can at least see, besides some of the questions in the chat, to see the thoughts about leadership and so forth. So Joe, if you can put up probably the multiple choice one.
Yes.
But, thank you. Talking about flourishing, you mentioned that. Okay, so we'll have, before we dive in, I guess we'll just keep that for a few minutes and continue, and we can circle back on that. So talking about flourishing, Rama, that word stuck in my mind, because I feel we want our organizations to flourish. We want leveraging creativity will help it flourish, but also to something I know within creative leadership has come up, and it's around inclusion. We are consistently hearing about EDI, all the different accessibility initiatives, and especially in light of BLM, that just grew. But why? The one thing I keep wondering, even though we're championing diversity, championing inclusion, why do we keep seeing the same mold being hired, being promoted, being celebrated on stage, in corporate? And why are these leaders who might be actually touting diversity, like starting their own organizations to support the gender parity and so forth, why are they why are these leaders also continuing this, perpetuating this? Which whenever I see something like that, I just am like, just have to like smile, because it's nonstop. So I guess maybe first we can, Rama, and then Adam, I would love your thoughts around this, because I think that's, especially when it comes to creativity, the diversity of thought, diversity of gender, race, and so forth is so critical too.
So this is where I'm very proud of saying that the model of creative leadership was born from inclusive design. And the first research fellow to work on it, Dr. Ninela Ivanova, made an observation. She said this model could have only come from a place where there is inclusive practice, because in inclusive practice, you look at the universality of human beings. You look at commonality, but you celebrate the difference. And part of the work we do in design looks at the differences of people. And, we've sort of boiled them down to 4 that are door openers. And the ex-head of the NHS really liked these. Nigel Crisp was their name. And it's age, ability, gender, and race. So, Adam, I love the 3 things that you gave. There are 4 things that are a litmus test to check the diversity of your teams, of your clients, of your customers, and your considerations, more importantly, and your prejudices. Is there a range of age across the age spectrum, range of ability, physical, sensory, cognitive, neuro, gender, not just binary, which is hugely important, but going beyond that to all the different gender identifiers and qualifiers that we see emerging and being defined. And race, what does that even mean? Ethnicity, culture, skin color. And on that one, of course, it's very, very close to my heart. And, recently a friend of mine turned around and said, it's interesting when you kind of combine gender and race, because women of color are ignored, men of color are judged. And I've been sitting with that for a week, sort of processing it, because it starts to speak about the great term of intersectionality. So the world is complex. Intersectionality can help us navigate it. But truly look at diversity, even beyond those 4 axes. They're only a gate opener. But the final bit to say is 2 things. Again, going back to research, McKinsey's diversity report shows some numerical reports and results. If you have men and women, so it's not just a single color or a single kind of, just men or just women. If you have a mixture in an organization, it can be up to 30% more likely to be financially, performance, around 25%. And if you look at ethnic diversity or racial diversity, that's over 35%. So that's there. There is a little health warning this comes with, that we had a company that came to us and said, we've got a team of 30 people, there's 27 nationalities, and it's across the kind of age and gender spectrum and the race spectrum, but they all think the same because they've all come to the same sort of cookie cutter mentality. So we also need to be looking at leaders beyond the, when I was at school, it was go into politics or be a lawyer and then you'll be a leader. I've heard, it's the sciences or go to business school and get an MBA. One of the questions I pose in the book is, why couldn't a poet or a poet or an artist or even a designer be a leader, or a school teacher? Why aren't we raising that outwards? And I've mentioned a poet. To quote a poet, Rumi said one of the most powerful things in leadership when they said, beyond these ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. And we're still struggling to find that field in leadership. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but a bit of a heartfelt one, I hope.
You mentioned when we talk about diversity and inclusion, I want to highlight one of those, which is the I, right? I think organizations sometimes can sort of tick the box, as it were, related to diversity because they can hire for it. And that's a policy question. And organizations, typically being large bureaucratic institutions, are often good about implementing policies. The trick is, okay, now you've hired for diversity. How are you going to leverage that diversity? How are you going to get any benefits from that diversity? And that has to do with inclusion. Is your culture going to celebrate and embrace the diversity? Or are you going to disincentivize it? Are you going to kill it? Are you going to create, as Rama said, cookie cutter thinking and inputs? I don't like the phrase onboarding, right, for new employees, because it has this implication of get on board, get with the picture, figure us out. And if you think about a lot of corporate onboarding or orientation procedures, they are incredibly one-sided. We, the company, are going to tell you, the new employee, about us so that you can be more like us and think more like us. What would happen if orientation, one's first impressions as a freshly minted colleague in an organization, would be, tell us about you. What makes you tick? What are your aspirations? What's your purpose? Why did you choose this career, this function? And why did you choose to do it here? And how can we help you be that more often? How can we help you be world-class at that every day? But instead, we sort of level off all the all that diversity. So that would be my the major point. It reminds me of a good example of a best practice, perhaps, though I haven't worked with them personally, but I've read a couple of good examples of Arup, the architectural engineer consultant. So they often say they will hire the poet, the musician, the scientist, the athlete, because you can always develop them to be architectural engineers, but you also, in order to be this paragon of creativity as an organization, you also want them to keep and bring to the fore that those diverse backgrounds. So yeah, absolutely, we need to hire for diversity, but inclusion is a cultural challenge. And because that's behavioral and involves changing habits, I think it's even harder.
I think we could probably have gone on even further about this topic and this area, because I think it's its own 1 hour conversation. But before we have a few more minutes left, I'd love to first see the poll results and see what people thought about empathy and even
Yes.
And I would love to capture a couple questions, or at least answer 1 or 2 from the audience. I think there's one, especially when you're talking about inclusion and diversity, just made me think of this one question about the relationship between shareholders and creative leaders. And I think also too, some of the questions I asked is like, how can we get a creative leader on the board? So I'd love to hear, what your thoughts are around that, because I feel shareholders definitely impact the direction of every corporation. So that is publicly traded. So maybe Adam, would you love to dive into that first, and then?
Sure. Well, the good news, my first book was called Next Generation Leadership, and I was looking at paradigms of Gen Y, Gen Z, the youngest generation in the workforce. But I don't mean that to say they're a small group of the workforce. They're actually, in a couple of years, will be 75% of the global workforce. And they are highly attuned toward purpose, values, inclusion, and et cetera. And so often people say, well, there's a disconnect, right, between the C-suite and shareholders because they have different criteria. But remember, with every new, for example, Gen Y CEO that assumes that position, there's a new Gen Y pension manager, fund manager, major investor, et cetera. So I think there is, if the optimist in me is saying there is and it's happening too slowly, but there is a gradual alignment of some of the values we've been discussing between the C-suite and the investor and analyst community. One example of that is the wonderful book Firms of Endearment, right, which show that those organizations that had a strong lived sense of purpose and values outperformed the market and therefore their competitive set by a factor of 10 over 10 years. So that's compelling evidence, not just for the ROI of being values driven, but also I think means that every year you see more and more funds, pensions, et cetera, that are oriented toward values, not pure ROI. But the funny thing is, those funds that had that orientation also got superior ROI. I'm generalizing, but it is actually a wider trend that has surprised and hopefully delighted a number of finance professors in recent years.
So I think we've got to stop blaming shareholders. So shareholders are often used as a business excuse. If we can't do this, the shareholders won't like it. And I think history is littered, the pathway of leadership is littered with companies that have blamed awful decisions on shareholders or hidden behind them. I think we also need to look at stakeholders and have them balance the shareholders, but kind of widen our rhetoric, our language, and our understanding to stakeholders actually being the consumers, the customers, the users, the people that are excluded by age, ability, race, and, increasingly visible, increasingly called out gender. So I think that for me is a really important balance of not just using the shareholder as a kind of straw shield for not doing anything or making wrong decisions or being quite tepid, and widening who we think is actually involved, who has a say, who has a meaning. And I think, quite often in inclusive design, we think about the wild card, extreme users, we call them. So when we were working with BlackBerry in 2005, 2006, we weren't the reason they went down, but we certainly were part of the thinking behind BlackBerry messaging, the first direct messaging servicing, because we said your next customer is a teenage girl, because teenagers were using text messages in a really culturally different way. And it just took that. So we said they need to be a stakeholder in your new phones. They have they have something to benefit. You have something to give. They have something to give. So think of it as a virtuous circle, not a vicious cycle. So I hope that's that's something with shareholders. Let's not demonize them. Let's expand the definitions.
I love that, Rama. And even just thinking like the next customer, sort of the next generation. And there's one question, I think we have like 5 minutes left. And there's one question I would love to, I guess, close the loop from where we started, especially speaking about creativity in schools and younger generations and how it's been stymied in a way. The question is, how can we be doing better to prepare Gen Alpha for entry into industry? And can we best ensure they, currently still kids, hold on to their creativity and use it as they enter the workforce? So it's Adam, would you like to dive into that, since that's sort of gravitating over towards the generational studies, research you've done?
Yeah, well, the harder answer is might schools consider reorienting what they consider the categories of education, right? So we generally put them into content categories: history, right? English, mathematics. And believe me, I am not being pejorative about any of those things. But perhaps we could also consider categories such as creativity versus a specific medium like music or whatnot, right? And what can we do to foster that as a human capability, just as we would foster the human capability of critical reasoning, or mathematical logic. I know we don't have a lot of time, so that's my short answer, and I'll leave it there.
And I think I'll have an equally short answer. There's a question here also from Roger Carr about letting go. And I think we need to let go of what we think leadership is, because we're kind of, we've heard of generational trauma, and particularly, something as a person of color that, has really helped me with some self-reflection. But are we generationally traumatizing or orientating people to outdated and outmoded forms of leadership? And so number one is we need to let go of what we define leadership is. And Adam said that beautifully earlier in the conversation. And the second is let's not edit it out of them. Again, I'm going to quote Adam here again, but there's that thing of the study you quoted, all the studies that we all know that, children do play together very, very freely, and bringing in that element of play, of freedom, of safety. We shouldn't just always be looking at leadership as something of production and progression. You need to usher in times of play and peace. And I think that's something we can learn from that generation. And let's grow it, let's enable it, and let them have the tools to define, refine, and even hold their own forms of leadership and teach us.
Well, I think that's a great way to tie things up right now on that, sir. But want to thank you, Adam and Rama. I think talking about leadership with the two of you, we were just getting going, and I feel that there's a lot more questions in the chat Q&A that I was like, wish we had enough time. So hopefully we can revisit those at another time. But anyhow, thank you again. Thank you everybody for attending, whatever time zone you're in. Greatly appreciated. And I think if anybody has questions, please reach out to us on LinkedIn and other platforms. Love to continue this conversation. And at this point, I guess we'll say our goodbyes. So bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye-bye.
who joined us for today's session. Adam, Rama, V, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. As we mentioned, if you have any additional questions, please reach out to us. And you can reach us as well from the contact information on the slide. Make sure to check our website for upcoming in-session talks. We have another one coming up about artificial intelligence tomorrow. Thank you for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye, everybody.